Am I all good to start? Also, am I audible?
Yes.
Panel, when deplatforming was always going to create incredibly harmful echo chambers, when it was always going to stop the kinds of harmful rhetoric that Seidenegg is going to talk to you about like, you know, insane conspiracy theories and really harmful rhetoric, we thought that when deplatforming was always going to heighten those things, that we had a principled responsibility to ensure that we didn't allow those kinds of patterns of behavior to proliferate, that we referred to better and more effective mechanisms by which we could prevent people from saying hateful things without feeding into and emboldening conspiracy theories in this debate. That is why we win, because we are able to prove to you, and we will prove to you consistently down the bench, that we are far better able to create respectful, safe political discourse without having to resort to deplatforming. So 1 point in setup and then 3 points of substantive. First of all, in setup, what do we stand for instead on the F? We stand for current measures like fact checking, deleting posts with hate speech and like representing them on like transparent like Twitter records, and like deplatforming other people. So we want it to be noted crucially that this motion is specifically about deplatforming elected officials. We thought we always retained the right to deplatform like key conspiracy theorists. We thought that was for a few reasons, the main one being 1, they are not elected, but 2, that their deplatforming is unlikely to embolden these kinds of conspiracy theories and the sort of like stop the steal narrative in the way that deplatforming elected officials was likely to do. We want you to know that we are saying that these things should happen to instead, and we're gesturing to them as alternatives that are already in place on these platforms. So first point in substantive. The first point to note here is that people actually need to hear from their elected officials, and there are 2 subclaims. First claim, sometimes, even when elected officials say really evil shit, they also say really relevant things sometimes, right? For example, we would point to the fact that a lot of like, you know, people who said really horrible, heinous things in the past also represented like good and necessary vaccine information, because it's like within their specific mandate and responsibility as elected officials to represent that information to their constituency, particularly if they're supporting a specific party. Secondly, we would note that, for example, even with Donald Trump, it was necessary that he was able to express his like political ideas in congressional happenings because he was the president of the United States and that was part of his responsibility. But thirdly, we would note that people have the right to know this kind of information about their politicians. They have the right to know what their elected officials believe in. And we thought that social media was the mechanism by which those politicians were likely to try to disseminate those views to the widest, biggest group amount of people. Second claim here, that people need to have access to this kind of information and to these posts in order to assess their elected officials. The first point here is that social media presence tends to be the indication of what that person actually wants and how they want to present. It demonstrates 2 things though. 1, it demonstrates how they want to present to the world, but secondly, it demonstrates other maybe hidden things that are not necessarily how they want to present, but that are functions of their social media presence. We thought this looked like 3 things. Number 1, it looks like who else they interacted with on social media. So whether they were interacting with like key conspiracy theorists. Secondly, it looks like whether there were trends in their posting, whether they were coming into certain trends. Thirdly, we had banners like fact-checking banners on Instagram and Facebook. We were able to still have those kinds of things present. Why was that so important? It meant that people could identify what kinds of things their politicians or elected officials were actually saying in their posts. We also thought that it was quite likely that if you removed these kinds of things and you made deplatforming the kind of natural conclusion when someone said something problematic, was it quite likely that those elected officials resorted to coded language, for example, veiling like anti-Semitic things in saying like the elite or like the global elite. We thought that meant that it was quite likely that it became very difficult to critique those people on the same level that you could when they weren't using that coded language, when you couldn't see who they were interacting with or what trends they were playing into. Speaker, at the end of this point, note that it is crucially important that people have this kind of information so they can make informed decisions about whether to re-elect that elected official, whether to bring official legal complaints against that elected official, or whether to like move for some kind of like wider political deplatforming rather than deplatforming on social media. We thought that was crucially important because when people didn't have this kinds of information, they were very unlikely to be able to make informed decisions about these things because they didn't have access to those opinions, to that information. We win there in terms of whether people actually know what their elected officials stand for. Second point in substantive is that you push people further into echo chambers. So what is currently happening? One, people are much more likely to engage in like, Facebook groups to get like alternative sources of information from those elected officials. Two, they're very likely currently to leave social media because they view this kind of deplatforming as being inherently intertwined with the left. But three, we thought this was quite likely to get far worse under side negative because all of those things were going to be like massively like amplified when you added deplatforming like constantly. Why was that super bad? There were a couple of reasons here. The first is that if you're in an echo chamber, you have far less exposure to moderate opinions. That means that you are only hearing the opinions of your specific people, or you're hearing the massively inflated opinions of your direct opposition. You're never hearing the reasonable opinions that were likely to proliferate in the middle, and you were always hearing opinions that were going to be quite hateful and quite vitriolic in their statements. Two, Parler is far worse than these kinds of platforms. We thought it was quite unlikely that Parler was going to be to deplatform people because they don't have the same kinds of like engagement requirements that Facebook or Twitter were likely to have. Why was that the case? One, you were quite unlikely to have direct pipelines to elected officials on things like Parler. You were quite likely to only be listening to pundits. Two, that meant that those people could fill that gap and they were quite likely to be talking about things that were far worse, far more vitriolic than what those elected officials were likely to be saying. But three, that silence from elected officials on social media and on those kinds of sites was likely to be taken as acquiescence. That meant you got a massive change in what kind of information was being presented as reasonable to these kinds of people. Vast impact in this argument is that fact checking was much more likely to get worse. One, we would note there is significantly less fact checking in like echo chambers, but secondly, we would note that if you were likely to start deplatforming more and more politicians, that it was likely people didn't trust those fact checking mechanisms anymore when they maybe would have initially, because it's much less offensive to people and much easier to cognitively understand that there is a fact check banner under a Donald Trump tweet than it is that Donald Trump's entire like Twitter account has been deleted. We thought that most people were quite likely to weigh that up and decide that the fact-checking therefore wasn't trustworthy at the point at which you had deplatformed him. At the end of that speaker, it's crucial to note we've just proven to you why echo chambers are likely to get so much worse under Neg's side. Last argument quickly here, that you were quite likely to problematically inflame current tensions between governments and tech firms. We would note that the relationship between governments and tech companies is already incredibly antagonistic over things like taxes in Australia, like deplatforming in Nigeria and privacy concerns in Europe. What could happen? One, regulatory overreach. One first impact here, it's quite likely that in response to deplatforming, that like governments will just take down the entire like social media site, right? We would note that, for example, Nigeria just took down Twitter for like a week following deplatforming. One, we thought that was really bad for activism because it meant that people didn't have access to those channels of communication, but they also didn't get to have any access to like telling the world what was going on. There are massive human rights abuses that get much, much worse the minute that you don't give people a mechanism to reach out to the world. If you make the relationship between technology firms and governments more and more antagonistic, it's quite likely that they lose those mechanisms for outreach. But secondly, the only information pipeline is now the deplatformed government, which means it's quite likely that they're not going to restore those channels of communication anytime soon. Second impact, political capital is likely to mean that forced regulation increases. So this means that governments essentially like threaten to ban specific platforms because of like fact checking. In our world, we can tack fact checking onto those regulatory processes because this sets horribly bad precedents for the ways in which governments interact with tech firms, because this meant echo chambers got worse and because this removed people's principled right to know what their elected officials stood for. We were incredibly proud to propose.
Yes, we thank the first speaker from the affirmative side for her remarks, and we invite the first speaker from the negative side. Yeah, okay.
Okay, just confirming I can be heard. And I do consent to being recorded, that's all good. There has been, in the history of social media, a single instance of a politician being deplatformed in the way that this debate is worried about. And I think that for any of affirmatives claims to have any impact on democracy, on people's right to know information. This would have to happen fairly regularly and to a good number of people. We'll explain structurally why this is unlikely, but also just at the start of the speech and of this negative bench, an empirical reminder that this has happened to one person. And I would suggest that this has happened to one person probably for the reason that punishments work at all. You know that it is there. You know that it is an option, and you know that it is perhaps a deterrent from you saying those things in the first place. Firstly, in what circumstances would platforms do this? Secondly, on why there's a right to control what's on your platform. And thirdly, what are the harms of letting these people stay on? Firstly, in what circumstances platforms would do this? We would say firstly that there are already a specific set of terms and conditions that everybody agrees to, contractually agrees to when they sign up for the platform. Unclear that they have proven why elected officials should not be subject to contracts that they freely enter. They were made aware of the terms when they signed up. That was the kind of thing that covered hate speech. It was the kind of thing that covered defamatory content, all that. We would secondly say that where they do ban people, it is likely to be done fairly well and for fairly good reasons. Note we cannot control Nigeria blocking access to all of Twitter, talking about single instances of politicians being taken down. Noting that the social media works on a network effect, which means that they want to avoid anything that does not maximize the base that is using their network. But secondly, these people in particular bring in an enormous amount of traffic, but importantly, traffic from the mainstream, because these are mainstream social media platforms. Thirdly, they're worried about that they would go to competitors, and they're fourthly worried that there'd be considerable backlash. Noting that we're talking about elected officials, where there will always then necessarily be a supporter base to give you backlash. This means that they're unlikely to do this rampantly or for bad reasons or without any warning. Noting that this is part of an escalating series of punishments or sanctions on these sites. We're not saying that you cannot delete posts or you cannot give a misinformation warning. Those are all things that we can do as well. But at the end of that, there has got to be an endpoint, or else nothing else matters in that chain of events. You could incite violence. You could post misinformation. You could do things like dog whistling in a way that people can actually understand. And you're benefiting from the verification which often exists on these platforms, but also just from the legitimacy of the platform itself and the legitimacy that that comes in virtue of you being an elected official. They have a few claims. I'll give a couple points of response. The first is to say the dissemination of information. There were many other official government delivery mechanisms for this information. Noting that politics existed before social media, there were things like additionally other accounts that were run by government departments and not a particular individual. There were official press releases. There was all of that. But secondly, we'd say that when it comes to seeing what the person you voted in is thinking or feeling, if they would say it on social media, they would likely say it in other settings as well. Noting that at, for instance, Trump rallies, he is not exactly shy about the things that he says. We'd thirdly say that what I've touched on already, which is that you do not just prevent the deplatforming of a single individual. You remove a powerful deterrent that says at the end of the line there is something that we can do. There is a last resort. Secondly, why you just have a right to control what is on your platform. First thing to say is quite obviously, these are businesses that we're talking about, and they're almost always publicly traded, especially at the point where they get to some degree of popularity. We would say that they have firstly a contractual and private right to control, to kick people to control and to kick people off of their platform. Again, those are agreements that are entered into freely. We would secondly say that they have an enormous obligation to shareholders, because usually when a social media platform decides to deplatform a single individual, or for instance a class of individuals like sex workers, it is for profit motivated reasons, because their profit is being impacted directly by less usership, or by just a general loss of reputation and therefore value in the company. We note that the directors of these companies are legally bound already by their directors' duties to maximize profit for that company, but also just support a general right to maximize profit for your company. Secondly, we'd say that there is actually an active obligation, because they concede that they would ban a normal person for the same reason. And the reason that we ban people for hate speech is not just because it's like bad in theory, it's because it actively harms people in ways that are very tangible. And so if you accept that we should ban an individual for harming another individual, or perhaps a handful of individuals with their hate speech, you should also believe that when that individual's reach is several orders of magnitude higher than just one person, when they have enormous legitimacy as an elected official and legitimacy from social media verification and their very presence on mainstream social media, we should censor what they are saying if the point it is harmful. And if it comes to it, remove them entirely from the platform if they refuse to comply. And we'd say that huge reach and electoral legitimacy also makes them algorithmically disproportionate in the way that they appear on people's screen, a bit on collaborative filtering later. But thirdly, to the extent that there's any obligation owed to like fundamentals of like people's right to know or free speech, which again, we would say that like a private social media company is not obliged to fulfill all of your rights to information, we would say that they are subject in broad terms to the censorship paradox, which is to say that if you want a maximum amount of information and views on your particular platform or in your particular forum, you do need to actively remove some instances of speech, and speech that is limiting, speech that makes people feel unsafe, speech that drives people away from these platforms, or speech that does serious damage to people. Fourthly, even if we treat them like more like media companies, which is I think where this affirmative team is going, where they have an obligation to report things to the public, which again I don't think they do, but we would also support like a media outlet's right to like not report on like the horrific thing that a politician said, or censor things for public safety. That's something we'd also stand by. Fifthly, we say that they may have a legal liability and therefore have a right to avoid that liability, because courts, especially in the West, are increasingly open to finding that host sites are responsible for, say, defamatory speech or hate speech that is hosted on their platform. If they will go after Google for merely having it in search results, they will absolutely go after social media companies for hosting it in the first place. It's not enough to say you will delete posts as they happen. Obviously, people can post things in very, very quick succession, or things can go unnoticed for a few hours. They said that they would keep a public record available of it as well. So unclear what that is, that is at that point. It's not enough. Eventually, you did just need to kick these people off. Thirdly in the speech, what are the harms of letting people stay on? We firstly would say that it emboldens them enormously when they know that there is actually nothing at the end of the road that can be done to remove them from the platform, that they are exempt from the rules that would bind ordinary citizens. So all of the harms I've referred to in the speech get much worse. We'd secondly say there's an enormous correlation between not just like Trump causing riots, but just hate speech online translating into hate crimes in real life from that inciting of violence, does real damage to people, that kills people. With thirdly, so that allowing this to occur conflates the office, rather not with the office's values, but with the values of the individual, which delegitimizes the office and subjects them to harm. Fourthly, say that there's a series of harms to misinformation. There is a harm to spreading intense like anti-vax rhetoric. There's a harm to telling a bunch of people to snort ivermectin or whatever that treatment was. Those are actual tangible harms. We'd fifthly say that because they become emboldened, all of the collaborative filtering harms of social media get worse. That is, people get more extreme and thus their viewership are shown more and more extreme content, which is how echo chambers form on social media in the first place. Sixthly, we'd say that this debate applies everywhere. So you also have to stand for like not being able to deplatform Putin, like somebody who is doing a genocide in the developing world. Those are the people that you have to support, not deplatforming. I think that's fucked up. So proud to oppose.
Yeah, this House thanks the Speaker for the House speech and invites the second Speaker from the affirmative side to continue the case.
Panel, if this policy was going to be applied so scrupulously that it was rarely ever going to ever occur, it was unclear why our mechanisms of simply taking down hate speech weren't going to be sufficient. But moreover, it was really troubling that none of the harms of literal governments in rogue states and despots taking down social media and precluding any type of political agitation and any type of overthrow was unresponded to largely in their case. A couple of things, two areas in the speech. Firstly, on the question of what actually happens and how this gets applied and disincentives, and then next on the question of political consequences and radicalization. On that first point, they tell us that like people consent to terms and conditions, and that was a sufficient reason for to why they're like obligated to follow these rules. Note that when we are principally balancing this against the right of the public to have an informed decision to exercise their vote, vulnerable minorities who have been disempowered by these same officials who have and need a right to be able to actualize their wants and grievances in the voting booth, we think that that obviously stands in as more important weighing off. So the second thing they tell us is that these companies have private rights we cannot like impede upon. Note there is a huge precedent of us doing that already, right? There's already talks to break up hegemonic tech companies and monopolies. There's already talks to regulate them in different ways. We think that there is a huge precedent of impeding upon private rights at the point at which it becomes in tension with the right of people in a democracy to actually vote in a way that is good for them. The next thing that they tell us is that you take away the disincentive for like public officials not to actually spew hate speech. First of all, if we are to believe their characterization, they have like a plurality of other delivery mechanisms like press releases, like other government sites. It was unclear for us why they were going to prioritize social media to the extent that it stopped them from publishing what they wanted to publish. But secondly, I think it's more plausible and like tenable in this debate that they likely value electoral outcomes more than they do merely banning their like ability to publish on a social media site because they have all of those other delivery mechanisms. If it comes between posting something that is incredibly incendiary and likely to rile up your base and get them to the voting booth versus do I get to keep my Twitter account, I think they're likely to choose that. For the third reason for why this disincentive idea doesn't work is because you literally give them political capital when you ban them anyway, right? That was for a lot of the mechanisms we give you at first, for as to how it emboldens the kind of conspiratorial narratives that you're being shut down, for as to why it inflames your like fan base, and as to why you actually get more attention as a result of doing that. Moving into the second question, censorship and whether or not deplatforming actually works. So we tell you at first very clearly that we can take down hate speech and we can put it on a registry such that it is available information, but it is not like disseminated to everyone on that site. We think that was sufficient in proving the fact that we did not get the kind of harms that they wanted to talk about, right? But the next thing that they tell us is that now you actually have an incentive to like do really bad. You have an increased ability to like conflate the office and the individual, and that's problematic for democracy. I just don't think that was contemplative of the fact that we needed people to associate the individual in the office, right? The reason why you wanted them to make that association was so that they got fired up enough to actually go to the voting booth and make a decision on that basis, right? At the point at which you don't see your elected official publish anything at all, we think we're far more likely to fall into the trap of voter apathy and not turn out a vote when that is probably really consequential for like your rights and your ability to exist in that society. So the next thing that they tell us is there are a lot of like other harms in terms of bad information and getting people to inject ivermectin into themselves. First of all, note the fact that we have the capacity to fact check these things, but secondly, in response, you were never comparative to the fact that we told you got these people onto echo chambers. At that point, you literally precluded any chance of having any fact checking. And I think that the number of people who are going to be dying of injecting like horse drugs into themselves was likely higher in that case because you never got the kind of fact checking that told you that was bad. Next, on the question of violence and whether or not we encourage that, firstly, I have to reiterate again, we take down speech that incites violence, right? That was really clearly made by us all down the bench. But secondly, note the fact that it was the Parler app and the type of echo chambers that you created that caused the January 6th insurrection and made it be so violent to the extent that people literally died, right? That was a direct consequence of echo chambers and the kind of hate you promulgated when you got rid of the ability to have fact-checking and a more moderate space for political discourse like we got on our side of the house. What else did they tell us? They tell us like now you get more vitriol or people like exposed to worse things on the internet. Why was that simply not true? Firstly, we already covered this, but like you'll be invariably exposed to vitriol, right? We think that there are going to be individuals spreading these conspiracy theories on all platforms. But note, secondly, how these social media sites actually work is that usually you have a lot of pages and like groups that work underneath that actually spread these things. So it's not necessarily those like public officials spreading them the majority of the time. Why is that really problematic? First of all, it was because the vitriol actually worsened under your side of the house, firstly by virtue of them going onto sites that weren't regulated, but secondly, because the individuals who stayed on those sites used codified language, or even if they didn't, they just became more inflamed and more incensed because they perceived that like their rights and their political freedoms were being taken away, right? That was the whole narrative stuff we gave you at first as well about how you like make it seem as though the tech companies are like colluding with like the left. We think that all of those things serve to worsen the type of vitriol that those individuals experience. The second thing to say here, and this was really critical, was now you diminish the political capital of key agitators and activists to point to the things that elected officials are saying and use that as a basis to turn out protests, to turn out rallies, and to get people to sign petitions, right? Why was that really critical in this debate? It had two key implications. First of all, you got more harm because you made the people who like those elected officials angrier. You made them more vitriolic and more likely to spread these kind of like harmful anti-Semitic conspiracies on every single resource they could. But secondly, because you disempowered the key groups that were needed to fight back against those agitators, to fight back against those despots or those kind of political leaders that we thought were problematic, right? So meaning that you just essentially made them exposed to more harm, and then secondly also just like took away any avenues that they had to actually fight against that. But no, that was especially important in the context that we brought you up first of governments like Nigeria, despotic rogue states, which now use this as a justification to A, shut down social media sites in their entirety, but secondly, to impose more like preclusive regulations to say that, oh, now you cannot have any fact checking whatsoever. Now you cannot ban anything or take down other forms of hate speech. I think that was a really huge implication in this debate because it meant that in those states where you probably needed that agitation the most, where you probably needed that discourse the most, you got the worst outcomes. What else do they tell us in terms of like people being exposed to it and this turning into hate? Okay, so we already tell you the reason first why this is likely to like occur in other forms, but not just secondly on the issue specifically of violence. We think that people become more violent at the point at which they perceive that their liberties are being taken away, right? That is just a very simple thing to understand in how that's a central element of how these conspiracies operate. I think it's far more plausible that you see people taking to the streets more because they now like have an even more inflamed idea of like these tech cabals who are trying to take away their rights and like fracture their political systems. That happens far more under your side of the house, in addition to all of the other harms of having them still spreading their hate. So at the end of this speech, note a couple of things. First of all, as they concede, these public officials do not have less mechanisms by which to share their hate. They still have press releases. They still have like other sites that they can go to. They still have echo chambers. The comparative differences were that messaging now occurred without any fact checking. But secondly, it occurred in a worse way because those echo chambers were unaccountable and often were places where incendiary hate could just spread. But secondly, note that you abrogated the rights of everyone living in that democracy or in that society to vote on an actionable basis. That meant that they could see the things our elected officials were posting and act in a way that was in line with that. At the end of this, we were the side of the house of protected democracy. We were the side of the house of protected individuals from losing their rights and from being radicalized. So proud to quote.
Yeah, we thank that speaker for remarks, and we will invite the second speaker from the negative side to continue with your case. Okay.
Hey, can I be heard? Yeah, awesome. It's strange to me that they're okay with banning politicians, but they're not okay with banning politicians, but they still want to ban other kinds of people that spread hate speech and do really shitty things, when that's the kind of thing that still pushes people to fringes and incurs all the harms that they talk about of radicalizing people. But what we distinguish is that politicians have more influence and an air of legitimacy, which more further and exponentially incites violence in ways that normal people don't. Their way of distinguishing politicians is literally, if you look over the notes of the first speaker's speech, but they're politicians with no principled reason for why they are different. And that is why they lose this debate, because we explain, in this instance, politicians create an exponentially higher degree of harm through the things that they kind of say on social media, while their side gives them a get out of jail free card. The first issue I want to deal with is, will people go underground, and is this bad? Yeah, they say that, like, it's basically a black market argument. They're like, if people can't be on the legit, nice and friendly official Twitter sites, then they'll go underground, and this will give them political capital and it'll embolden their narrative and deepen the conspiracy. And that's about where their analysis ends, right? The first thing to say is, to a very large degree, they literally cop the same kind of harm because they're liberally supporting using misinformation filters and deleting their posts, which, as second speaker conveniently identifies for us, the reason why people are angry isn't because they literally can't perform the mechanical action of clicking on Twitter anymore. It is because they feel like there is an imposition on their expression. And they have that imposition on their expression when they delete their posts or mark them with random like filters and all that kind of stuff. But obviously, if their site obfuscates the ability for people to communicate to their audience so much that they feel like they're not getting that same reach, which is probably the intended reason why they're applying these filters, those people will go to those underground sites anyway. The last thing to say is, I think if anything, their policy feeds the conspiracy narrative more, because the very discreet application of things like misinformation filters and deleting posts is very untransparent and very arbitrary, as opposed to a ban which goes against clear community guidelines is absolute. So it's not like this post yes and this post no, pick and choose based on what social media likes. It is a complete and absolute ban, which is very, very clear to understand. Now, the thing that you need to consider, besides the fact that they cop a large degree of this harm, is to the degree at which we cop some people going to these underground shady sites. Is that actually a bad thing? Because the reason why you run a black market argument normally in debates is for three reasons. The first is when you say black markets are more harmful than the regular market. So these underground sites are more harmful, which intuitively seems less true when you consider that website traffic, unlike physical black markets, are based on critical masses of networking and people visiting the sites, which means that when you go to an underground conspiracy site, you have far, far less reach, right? Your harm reaches thousands of people as opposed to millions of people. The second thing to say is you have less logistical function. If you look at the Capitol riots, the reason why those riots were organized so quickly is because they could use the medium of Twitter, which could reach a lot of people in official capacity very, very quickly. It is very difficult to organize that kind of violence on an underground red site. So it's unclear that these sites are actually more harmful. But the second thing to say is maybe the problem with black markets is that they aren't regulated. They're like, these underground sites aren't regulated like Twitter is. Twitter is great and regulated. The problem is they get rid of that regulation as per the topic, right? The very regulation that punishes politicians for spreading hate speech, which is the ban we support on our side, is a thing that they're getting rid of. So they are just making the normal conventional market the black market. They're just making the literal, like the Twitter and Facebook, the underground shady sites for people to spread their hate speech. And then their third, this is probably their best claim. They're like, maybe by pushing them underground, you make their claims more legitimate because now that they've been censored, it's like deep in the conspiracy and it's all true and all that kind of stuff, right? The first thing to say is that if this claim is about echo chambers, social media companies form echo chambers as well. That is the point of those algorithms. Yes, maybe on one sense, you're on a website dedicated for incels. In another sense, you have a newsfeed dedicated for incels, but you're still trapped into that echo chamber of incels on either side. But the second thing to say is maybe their idea of making claims more legit is true for low-key conspiracy theorists, which they're happy to ban, by the way. The conspiracy theorists who have no social cachet in society. And therefore, when the government arrests them and the government clacks down on them, they're like, it's the government's fault. The problem is, in this debate, we're talking about elected officials. Elected officials derive legitimacy and support from the nature and their presence in the office, right? That is why they dog whistle, because they don't want to actually be associated with violence and vitriol. They just kind of dog whistle it. And that's the problem, right? These kind of people, if they're forced to be if they're banned and they're forced to go to an incel website, they lose every shred of legitimacy that they have. And that is the medium through which they gain support. Because unlike a conspiracy theorist who gains support from the fact that they are oppressed, a politician, an elected official gains support from the fact that they are official and legitimate and mainstream, right? And that is why the mechanism of the black market does not apply here, because we kill the legitimacy of those elected officials. So on net, we massively reduce the net harm of their discourse. And maybe they have a sliver of conspiracy theories, but they're disorganized, they're low reach, they don't get anywhere. And literally empirically, we see for Trump, Trump lost all of his legitimacy after the Capitol riots. No one voted him, no one cared about him. And I guess they say at second, you reduce the ability for activists to point out and criticize these posts. But now they have the smoking gun of just pointing out and criticizing the fact that they're so bad at social media that they got banned. I think that is fine on our side. The other harm they say under this idea is like, well, maybe politicians will go into a weird black market zone where they'll dog whistle even more with even more coded language on official sites so they don't get banned. The first thing to say here is if their coding is so complex that they can avoid the eye of social media experts, they'll probably also avoid the eye of a lot of people using social media companies, websites, and therefore reduce their reach. But the second thing to say is, as an impact, reducing the explicitness of public vitriol is important, because when something is taboo and something is hidden, minorities in a country feel safer because they do not feel that the institution of the White House is literally endorsing your oppression. That is the thing that happens on your side when you just allow Trump to do whatever the fuck he wants. On our side, we take a stand, and that is the thing that makes people happy. Let's quickly talk about the relationship between tech and government, because they're like, well, we might not be able to win the first debate about conventional social media, so let's run a developing world extension. The problem with this extension is, if there is such a huge benefit to the Nigerian government for censoring the free speech of people and getting rid of social media, they don't need this as a justification. They will just get rid of social media. That's what China does. It is unclear to me why the decision to ban a specific official from speaking after multiple warnings is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Clearly, the threat to those governments isn't the banning of an official speaking. Clearly, the threat is, as they say, the protests that these activists in these countries are making. Given that is the imperative, those governments will just get rid of social media anyway. It is unlikely they can actually shoehorn this argument into this debate. Rather, Connor explains that the imposition of the government on the social media company to act freely in a principle sense is a thing that is more likely to wear down that relationship. Lastly, in terms of principle, they basically wear out this principle when they're like, they support other things that moderate it. Like, it's clearly not non-contingent, but given there are other ways to convey information, these people can contravening community guidelines, the free speech paradox Connor talked about, and also we're just banning them at the point when the information is not valuable and bad anyway. I don't think this breaks any laws of the Bible. For these reasons, we're very, very, very proud to oppose.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm all good to speak.
Yeah, audible.
Okay, awesome. I'm so proud of Rose and Sierra, and I'm particularly proud that after the work that they did in their speeches, I'm left scratching my head at this negative case as to where the change is and to where any of their harms are. Because the pieces of characterization that came out somewhat contradictorily within Connor's speech, and then again contradictorily at David's, tell me the few following things. They're going to dog whistle because they're scared of getting banned, which is why banning doesn't really happen right now. And also we can also moderate their speech. So I don't know. I don't know what you've got in your paper, Adjudicators, but I'm literally left asking, what is the point? What is the point of their side? What do they have besides a corporation's principle? What do they have besides some shoddy responses to our discourse material at second? I think we're still up on the strength of the beautiful substantive brought by my novices alone. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, on governments and the metrics for this debate. Secondly, on discourse. Thirdly, on the nature of speech. Might switch those last 2. Firstly, just this some more mostly extraneous thing. The first question is whether the frequency of this should be a metric for the debate. I don't think we need to prove it happens a lot for it to be a bad thing that in principle shouldn't be allowed or practically shouldn't be allowed in the instances in which it happens. Note that we still ban things that are unlikely to occur anyway, like developing nuclear weapons in your backyard. That wasn't a metric for this. They needed to prove specific harms. The second thing is this allowed? Note that I think corporate free principles also weren't written in the Bible, David. I didn't give a shit about your corporations. I was happy to tear up contracts. We controlled the law. The law didn't control us. And even were this the case, there are precedents, both in the way that we organize and change contract laws currently and into the future when we pass legislation, and secondly, in diplomatic immunity for public officials in other countries. This is analogous to things that we did. And even if we didn't, I don't give a shit about corporations. I think they should be all held to more public account. I'd love to see that type of thing happening. Next thing in this issue, before I move on to discourse, is they said it's not going to be done badly, even if it does. David realizes that Nigeria sunk their case from first speaker and tried to pick this up at the end of his second negative speech. What happened there was literally you deplatformed officials. Twitter was taken down. Now the only source of information was for the totalitarian government. For them to win this issue, they had to prove to you on the basis of intuition that this would never be the tipping point for a totalitarian regime removing a platform. We just had to suggest that it may be, and we can point at empirical examples, but the fact that it may or could be was a big enough harm unto itself, especially if those trends were able to change in the future. We didn't rely on future prediction in sense like they did for their benefits to materialize. So at that point, I thought that the reason that like Putin mattered in this debate, as per Connor's speech at first, was in fact because Putin, if he wasn't allowed to have his like Russian state media or his his Twitter account and saying whatever he wants on like whatever social media the Russians use, perhaps would ban that media and do what China does. Some states as China always do it, some states wouldn't. There would be some in the middle. That's empirically true. That seemed really important to me, given the impacting that wasn't responded to from first and second. Second question in this speech on the nature of speech. I'm going to talk about a few different things. Firstly, on hate speech, we get a few different responses from this because they realized that they were up shit creek with no paddle when we could just ban hate speech and like record that we did it on a transparent register. Here are their responses. Here are my responses to their responses. It's not clear and it's like arbitrary. I don't think that's true. It's like codified under law. It could be audited and we're going to do a clear and transparent register. If that's not what is clear and unarbitrary, I don't know what is. Two, they had this point where they were like, no, because you can still like access the hate speech through other. So when they were responding to my to the point that we had about coded speech, they were like, oh, no, you can still like understand what your officials are about and successfully adjudicate them based on like, them having rallies and that type of stuff, even if like we don't have them on social media. If that was true, you were also able to get like hate speech or any of the things that would incur a ban under their house. But note that that's worse than symmetric for them because the barrier to understanding that someone said faggot is so much lower to the barrier to understanding what the collection of their political views were, especially in the ways that those amplified across social media, as was told to you at Rose, to no response. I thought that we got more accurate information on that. I thought that we were able to remove hate speech. But I'd also just like to empirically ask you, I think the average reasonable voter knows that they hear a lot less from Donald Trump, specifically when he was deplatformed rather than the date at which he lost the election. It does have a difference, and it has a difference. It has a difference empirically. It has a difference as well, just because obviously it reaches a shit ton of people. It reaches immediately, and algorithms push it across lines of interest. Next, on coded speech. So I think that this point was uniquely debate winning as well, because note that the world that we had is one in which we didn't ban like social media companies from like potentially removing these people. So you had a level of coded speech anyway. This was Donald Trump before he was deplatforming, say he was really proud of the Capitol rioters, which by the way, were organized on Parler. Like you said, that couldn't happen in a second. It's literally how it happened. But anyway, so we have Donald Trump being like, I'm so proud of you and that type of stuff. Insofar as if he said like, oh, you were justified and you're really good, we may know that he should potentially be impeached or we should really hate him a lot more. He would be pushed off. The fact that the coded language exists because of the potential for you to receive those types of negative ramifications, at least in some marginal cases, means that people are more emboldened because they see their leaders speaking their language. And it also makes it harder to reliably critique them. So note that it's harder for me to reliably be like Donald Trump knew exactly what he was doing because of the nature of that coded speech that received no sufficient response. The final thing about speech is about like, whether people need information from their elected officials. They said this isn't a principle. I think it's more of a principle than their principles, but also there's a reason why Dan Drews has more followers than the DHS on Twitter. There's a reason why Trump has more followers than the White House. And that's because people like individuals because they're human, they're funny, they're popular, the celebrity culture exacerbates this, and you feel like you're getting it from the horse's mouth. So it was always going to be more interesting to follow them. They were always going to have a broader reach. They tended to speak in more human language as well. That's why it was more important that we got it from them. And just because you could get it through other means does not mean that removing them was in some way restricting their ability to hear from their elected officials. I think they had a principled right that has gone unchallenged beside assertion to hear from said elected officials. Final point in this speech on discourse, a few different things here. One, legitimization is worse when it's coded, as I've already explained. Two, when you don't hear from these officials, their silence is taken as acquiescence, because the way conspiracy theories work is around nefarious intent. You imagine that things are going on that aren't. You imagine people are out to get you, which is why when Trump did go silent, not when he was deplatformed, but when he was silent for a little bit, that's when people were saying Trump actually wants us to, do this 4chan conspiracy theory. He thinks that he is like, taking a pause, and this is when like the CIA is going to do something, and they didn't. But the fact is, when you're not speaking, it's far easy for minor demagogues and random people on the internet to put words in your mouth and to poison discourse in that way. Next, David wanted to say, oh, it's like an underground like black market, and this is like potentially even better. But note that this point was scalable. So at best, all of that material was mitigatory, because we said that because there were going to be if it was less of an imposition to be fact checked, less of an imposition to do coded speech like they already do, and also less demand and less audience that you reach. They were all of these reasons why you might prefer to be on like a public platform, even just for the legitimacy which you were granted by being acknowledged by one of the popular institutions of society, such as new media. So they needed to prove that to a greater extent. And even if they did, we still win that point because we show marginal change. Note that only some people needed to be on Parler, where those riots were empirically organized. Note as well that when people organize riots, they don't go, oh, can I? Thus I should. They go, I want to, how can I? And they organize their use of platforms around that instead. I thought that you were going to trust other sources less, because this played into the narrative in an absolute and scalably more measure of saying that liberals were in cahoots with big tech. At the end of this speech, we won on a few different hurdles. We won on Nigeria and what happens in the developing world empirically, but also proved by substantive, which it's too late to change in this debate. We won on a realistic characterization of discourse, and by engaging accurately with the current world, potential future worlds, and our like preferred worlds, we were able to show you why speech got a lot worse and a lot more damaging for the most vulnerable people. For these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
Yes, we have the third speaker from the affirmative side for that speech. I invite the third and final speaker for the round from the negative side to close the debate. Go ahead.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Speaker, the opposition ran this really strange line towards the end of the case, which was that we heard less from Trump when he was silent. We heard less from Trump when he got voted out, not when he was deplatformed, because that stirred up controversy. No, we literally heard it less from him when he was deplatformed, because he was silent, because he was deplatformed, right? He was very loud after he got voted out. That was kind of the reason he ended up getting deplatformed. He started a riot on the Capitol, something the opposition keep forgetting. I'm going to do two things. Firstly, look at the impacts around social media. Secondly, look at the principles around the rights and obligations of companies. These are not irrelevant like the opposition want to say. And if I decide I want to deal with it, I'll talk about Nigeria, but I think it's stupid and not important. All right, so onto the first one of the impacts of social media. My first question here is, what's up with echo chambers? They give us a few things here, right? Firstly, they say non-elected officials will take the places like an influencer. Firstly, I guess this already happens. Two, they even modeled in that they can ban problematic people. So I guess we can do that too. If they're being problematic and pretty bad, we can ban them. Three, and the third thing is why they're just preferable to exist over big politicians, which is one, they have a much smaller reach. They have and they just have a much less authority when they're talking, and and like putting this information out there. So we didn't think these were like going to be particularly bad echo chambers. But the second thing they gave us here is, well, you lose credibility with fact checking. There's some big conspiracy and you just play into this narrative. All right, firstly, you lose the credibility of fact checking at the point where you don't follow up on repeated abuses of like ignoring those like fact checking principles, right? When there is no deterrent to like stop putting out this misinformation apart from like a little thing at the bottom, which the opposition have already said has connections to like conspiracy theories already, then that fact checking has no relevance, right? You have no like impact for that. The next thing to say is there's just no need to fact check under our side at the point where they have so many repeated abuses, we can just ban them, right? So it doesn't matter if fact checking loses credibility. That does not affect echo chambers. And the final thing to say here is like literally what they were talking about. Fact checking is just often ignored because of politicization. This is the only effective deterrent that we can provide these people, right? So what did we tell you about about echo chambers? We told you that collaborative filtering algorithms, which exist in like the core of these companies, means that like you're going to get shown more and more extreme stuff at the point where a politician is saying more and more extreme stuff and and like also getting likes from like extreme groups. When Trump tweets about the Proud Boys and you've like liked Trump tweets before, even if you are a moderate Republican, you are now connected in a like a content base, and you were shown content that those people liked before. This probably means more people are going to be radicalized or shown more and more content around those things. That's a much bigger and more concrete harm, and actually like exactly how echo chambers work. Not just that like, oh, maybe there'll be some underground, maybe there'll be some like anti-vax influences, right? Now the final push they give us here is like, oh look, the Parler app. Firstly, they were already there. And the only reason they were already there was because it doesn't ban hate speech. David told you this and they just ignored that point, right? The second thing to say is you need a critical mass of people on a social media site for it to be an effective social media site. Two impacts of this. Firstly, if you are spreading misinformation and like dangerous speech on Parler, it doesn't matter, no one's going to see it. But the second thing to say is most people just don't want to leave Twitter anyways because they know all their friends on Twitter. So at the end of that, what happens to echo chambers? We get rid of like a figurehead of these echo chambers. We get rid of like what these social media companies use to group people into like groups, political groups, and showing them content more like that. What they do is literally just like allow this hate speech to continue and have no repercussions, right? So that's why echo chambers are worse under their side. But now that's the second thing of people's experience. The opposition was like really proud, and like the third speaker was really proud of like the 5 reasons they gave at first. But guess what? They're actually all the same one, which is that people just need this information or like need this connection to their politicians. A few things wrong with this. The opposition like framed this as evil but relevant, right? But we think it's just wrong. Like look at Trump. That was not evil but relevant. That was evil and irrelevant, right? It was hate, dog whistling, misinformation. That's what Trump was. There was no relevant information there. It was just build the wall in all caps and like badly typed tweets, right? So then the second thing here is people obviously just have other avenues for information, right? We've been saying this all the way down the bench and they keep going, oh, well, you can't rely on that. Like people just like get press conferences. People just watch the news. People can just see if Trump is in handcuffs on the lawn. You don't need to tweet about Trump. You don't need to see Trump like tweeting like I've been unjustly like in prison. Like you can just follow these things. It's probably better if people aren't getting all their news from one politician. That's probably a good thing that we avoid that. So at the end of that, we just didn't think people's experience got worse. Don't be fooled by their 5 mechanisms. They were all the same thing, right? The next thing to say is if people's experience, like enjoyment of the platform gets slightly worse, that's fine, so long as they're not consuming hate speech and like spreading of this stuff. So yeah, even if they win that, we don't care, right? So then the next question is, what is the impact of the platform on the platform, right? They give us this push that dog whistling happens a lot more. All right, a few responses to this. Firstly, it's less public. So even if dog whistling happens more, it's less proliferated hate speech, which is a really good thing, right? The second thing to say is under that is that it's just probably a safer platform when there's less direct and oppressive hate speech. And you also just like denormalize the presence of that hate speech on the platforms, which is why we would prefer dog whistling. The second thing is because like inherent in the nature of dog whistling, you're just reaching a smaller audience of people who understand what this is. And again, that is just a massive benefit because people aren't seeing Trump like overtly like supporting, I don't know, Capitol rioters or something, right? The third thing to say here is it's probably just like relatively easy for these social media companies to regulate. So if they wanted to take a hard stance against this, they probably could. Everyone saw through what Trump was doing at that rally the day before. All right, so the next thing they tell us, so that's why dog whistling is actually better if it increased, but we also just don't think it increases, right? The next thing to say here is like, oh, you embolden people, you give them political capital, you deepen conspiracies. All right, this is wrong. Being banned is not cool, it's humiliating. It's like you're getting kicked out of a public park because you're like too drunk, right? The next thing to say here is that like when what David said, no response again, a theme in their case, is that when you're elected, you get your legitimacy from being official, right? Not from being just like, subject to conspiracy theories, right? We think those like conspiracy theory influencers do get it that way, but like officials like need to appear official because they have power and they're meant to be like the leaders of a country. You lose that when you're banned, right? So even if they are, but let's say they are emboldened, right? They are given political capital. They're banned. What are they going to do with it? Who cares? Next thing to say here is that you give them legitimacy by keeping them on the platform, like, and that probably gives them like maybe doesn't make them more bold, but gives them more legitimacy and spread, right? And the final thing to say is just like removing the ability to ban them would embolden them way more. Like they have no consequences for their action now. What's going to do? Get suspended for 7 days, have one post taken down? Like it doesn't matter. Clearly they're going to be more bold on your side. Now, at the end of that, the third speaker was bold enough to ask for benefits. I'll tell you what Connor said. We rope in bad politicians. We ban the people who just don't follow the rules. We send a message, have a massive deterrent, and we massively reduce echo chambers. It would be just enough for our side to prove that we don't get another Capitol riots incident. So at the end of that, those are the benefits that you missed to rebut. And at the end of that, that's why we get significant like benefits overall to the political system, these platforms, and the information these people are consuming. Quickly onto like the rights and obligations of companies. They had this like small one about the right to information. It's contingent. And we already told you how we want to maximize free speech, and that given that we're only banning bad information, we don't really care about this right? So compare that to the rights of companies, which they just dismissed, right? These are like really important because like this is how society functions. So if you start infringing on those, then lots of other things are at risk, right? But like, let's just say we don't care about the rights. Let's talk about obligations of companies. Obligations of companies are important because they have positions of power and authority over like consumers, right? And so they have an obligation to make sure their platform is very safe. They have an obligation to make sure as a social media company, there's a maximization of free speech. And they have an obligation to make sure they're treating people fairly, not just giving people one off because they were elected one time. And that is why I'm very proud to negate.
Yeah, thank you very much.